The rain fell in relentless sheets, turning the scarred landscape into a quagmire of mud, blood, and despair. Trenches carved into the earth with trembling hands and bitter determination, stretched as far as the eye could see, zigzagging across. Scarred fields that were once villages, forests, and farmlands. In these narrow, waterlogged corridors, soldiers huddled together, sharing the weight of fear, hunger, and exhaustion. Above them, the sky roared with the thunder of artillery, and the acrid smoke of gunpowder clung to their lungs like a poisonous fog. Each day was a battle for survival, each night a fragile reprieve from the relentless onslaught. This was not the war celebrated in parades or sung in patriotic songs. This was the hidden war, fought in the claustrophobic darkness of the trenches, where heroism and horror intertwined in a daily struggle that few living could comprehend. The genesis of trench warfare had come not from grand strategy or deliberate invention, but from necessity. As armies clashed with modern weaponry, traditional charges across open fields became suicidal. Machine guns tore through lines with unerring precision, and artillery reduced entire battalions to dust and ash. Commanders, desperate to preserve their men, dug deep into the soil, creating long, fortified trenches to shield soldiers from the unceasing rain of fire. What began as a tactical measure soon transformed into a new reality of warfare, a static, unyielding front where neither side could advance without inviting annihilation. Soldiers found themselves trapped in these earthen fortresses, their lives dictated by the pulse of the artillery and the invisible terror that lurked just beyond the barbed wire. Yet the trenches were more than a defensive innovation. They were incubators of human suffering and resilience. Frostbitten limbs, gangrenous wounds, and the ever-present threat of disease became companions as constant as comradeship. Rats, drawn by the scent of decay, feasted without restraint, and lice scuttled over skin already slick with sweat and mud. Every meal, every attempt at rest, was a gamble against illness and the ever-looming specter of death. Letters from home, when they arrived at all, carried distant warmth, but also a cruel reminder of the life left behind. A life that seemed to exist in a different, unreachable world. Yet within this crucible of hardship, bonds were forged. Men shared stories, smuggled morsels of food, and comforted one another through the small mercies of humor and companionship. But the trenches were not only prisons, they were stages upon which the horrors of modern industrial warfare were made manifest. Battles were no longer about courage in the traditional sense, but about endurance, strategy, and the merciless calculus of attrition. Shell craters became impromptu graves, no man's land, a vast expanse of death where the fallen lay untouched for days. Soldiers learned to read the sky for the telltale signs of artillery, to identify the subtle tremor of incoming fire, and to move with ghostly precision across the mud and wire that defined their world. Every day demanded vigilance, every hour exacted a toll, and every night offered only the illusion of safety beneath the cold, indifferent stars. Yet even amidst the suffering, moments of surreal beauty and fleeting humanity persisted. Dawn breaking over a shattered landscape, the quiet sound of rain in a lull between barrages, the camaraderie shared over a shared cigarette or a whispered joke. These fragments of life offered glimmers of hope in a world otherwise defined by chaos, soldiers clung to these moments, knowing that their survival depended as much on the preservation of spirit as on physical endurance. They were the silent witnesses to the transformation of war into something both unimaginably brutal and profoundly human. And then, as the world watched, the scope of trench warfare would expand, engulfing entire nations and reshaping history itself. Strategies evolved, artillery grew deadlier, and the human cost mounted beyond imagination. Yet behind every statistic and battle report, there remained the individual soldier, trapped in mud and darkness, confronting fear in its purest form. The trenches were a mirror of humanity at its extremes, courage intertwined with terror, loyalty tested by adversity, and life persisting stubbornly in the face of relentless death. This was the reality that the world would come to know as the Great War. But it was also the reality hidden in plain sight, a story of suffering, resilience, and the secret struggles of men trapped in trenches that no monument or history book could fully convey. And as history would unfold, the lessons of these silent warriors would echo through time, a testament to the endurance of the human spirit, even in the muddy, rat-infested trenches of the First World War, scarred the European landscape. The concept of fighting from fortified positions had slowly begun to take root in military thought. Armies had once clashed across open fields, where courage, discipline, and the ability to charge in formation determined the outcome of battles. Cavalry swept across plains, infantry marched in rigid lines, and artillery, while devastating, lacked the precision and destructive power to completely halt advances. These open-field confrontations demanded valor, stamina, and an almost theatrical sense of heroism. Yet, as weaponry evolved, so too did the limitations of these strategies. By the mid-19th century, the emergence of rifled muskets and more effective cannons began to render traditional battlefield tactics increasingly suicidal. Armies could no longer rely solely on massed formations. The killing fields of new technology required protection, concealment, and the nascent beginnings of trench warfare. The first tangible examples of fortified positions arose not from a desire to innovate, but from necessity. During the Crimean War, soldiers constructed rudimentary earthworks to shield themselves from the improved accuracy of enemy fire. These early trenches were crude, narrow ditches hastily dug beneath the direction of officers who had learned that linear formations could no longer ensure survival. But within these shallow excavations, men discovered a new kind of warfare, one that emphasized patience, endurance, and adaptability over the grandeur of open-field maneuvers. The trench was no longer just a shelter. It became a space where survival itself was the ultimate objective. The psychological shift required of soldiers was immense. Courage was no longer measured by the ability to charge a line, but by the capacity to endure weeks, months, and sometimes years of exposure, waiting for a battle that might never come more, might come in a fury of artillery and machine gun fire. By the time of the American Civil War, the potential of trench warfare had become unmistakable. Both Union and Confederate forces employed trenches and earthworks in defensive positions with striking ingenuity. At battles such as Petersburg, lines of dugouts and fortified positions stretched for miles, and the soldiers who manned them learned quickly that the war above ground was nothing compared to the struggle within the confines of the trenches. Life in these early trenches revealed the cruel duality of war. They offered protection from enemy fire, yet introduced new hazards, including disease, unsanitary conditions, and the psychological strain of continuous confinement. Men faced the tension of constant danger and enforced stillness. Every decision to move, to expose oneself, could mean instant death. At the same time, these positions allowed smaller units to hold off vastly superior forces, demonstrating the tactical potency of entrenched defense and setting a precedent for the static warfare that would dominate decades later. In Europe, during the Franco-Prussian War, field fortifications and temporary trench systems again highlighted this transition. Armies relied increasingly on defensive engineering to counter the lethality of modern firearms and artillery. Soldiers constructed networks of trenches, ditches, and barricades, often under fire. And these early innovations planted the seeds of a war entirely defined by attrition. But the soldiers who dug these trenches also began to understand that survival depended on more than physical protection. The psychological burden of confinement, fear, and anticipation became as potent as any bullet or shell. Men endured long hours in silence, listening for the subtle signs of enemy movement, learning to detect danger through sound, smell, and instinct. The trenches were teaching a cruel lesson. The human mind could be as vulnerable as the human body. This shift toward static, grueling warfare also marked a profound change in military culture. Whereas earlier generations had valued boldness, mobility, and decisive action, the new reality demanded patience, discipline, and resilience. Soldiers learned to master the art of waiting, to remain alert for hours, often doing nothing but clutching their rifles, eyes scanning the horizon for threats invisible to the untrained eye. Commanders began to rethink strategy as well, realizing that controlling territory required not only offensive brilliance, but defensive ingenuity. The interplay between firepower and fortification reshaped the relationship between technology and human endurance. By the dawn of the 20th century, the signs of a new kind of war were unmistakable. Armies across Europe had experimented with trenches, dugouts, and fortified positions, and the lessons of these conflicts were carefully studied. It was becoming evident that the next great war would be defined not by rapid maneuvers, but by a deadly equilibrium, where survival could be as lethal a challenge as combat itself. Soldiers would be required to navigate a landscape where the earth itself became a weapon and a shield, where mud and blood defined the rhythm of life, and where courage meant enduring unrelenting fear day after day. The trenches, in all their crude beginnings, foreshadowed a conflict that would transform warfare into an unyielding test of human endurance and ingenuity. A war in which the ordinary soldier became both the victim and the witness of history's most Great War thundered across Europe in the summer of 1914. The world believed it was witnessing a conflict that could be won with swift maneuvers, brilliant strategies, and heroic charges. The illusions of rapid victory, long cultivated by decades of military theorists and national pride, were shattered almost immediately. Modern industrialized weaponry, machine guns, rapid-firing artillery, and smokeless powder rifles had transformed the battlefield into a lethal expanse where traditional tactics no longer applied. An infantry regiment charging across open ground, once the pinnacle of battlefield courage, now became fodder for a new era of killing machines. The landscape, once a canvas for maneuver, was turned into a deadly chessboard where survival depended, not on valor alone, but on fortification, concealment, and endurance. It was this brutal reality that forced armies into trenches, where soldiers would spend years locked in a war of attrition that was as psychological as it was physical. The initial movements of World War I, particularly on the Western Front, revealed the stark contrast between strategy and reality. Germany's Schlieffen Plan, intended to sweep through Belgium and crush France before turning eastward, initially succeeded in speed and precision. Yet, as German forces approached the outskirts of Paris and Allied resistance stiffened, the promise of a swift, decisive campaign evaporated. The battlefield, saturated with troops and strewn with artillery, became an arena of immobility. Any attempt to advance across open fields invited annihilation under a storm of bullets and shells. It was in response to this deadly equilibrium that the trenches, already an idea familiar from earlier conflicts, evolved into a permanent, defining feature of the war. Where mobility had once dictated the flow of battle, stasis now dominated. Lines of trenches, stretching hundreds of miles from the North Sea to the Swiss border, became the backbone of European warfare. A grim lattice of life, death, and enduring human suffering, the Western Front, infamous in history, became the stage upon which this new form of warfare would reach its apogee. The front line was rarely a single trench. Rather, it was a complex network of frontline support and reserve. Trenches, each meticulously constructed for both defense and communication. Observation posts perched precariously above these lines allowed officers to gauge enemy movements, direct artillery, and coordinate limited counterattacks, while the vast stretches of barbed wire and machine gun nests formed deadly barriers across the shattered earth. Between opposing lines lay no man's land, an expanse of churned mud, shell craters, barbed wire, and the remnants of those who had fallen in previous attempts to cross it. Crossing it was a death sentence for the unprepared, and yet it was traversed repeatedly in waves of futile attacks that left tens of thousands dead or wounded in a single day. The trenches, therefore, were not merely defensive structures. They were instruments that dictated the tempo and nature of the war itself, forcing both sides into a relentless cycle of preparation, defense, and attritional violence. Life within these trenches was a study in contrasts, a constant negotiation between endurance and despair. Above ground, soldiers faced the ceaseless threat of enemy fire, the deafening roar of artillery, and the ever-present menace of snipers. The very earth around them was a weapon, each shell creating craters that could swallow men whole, and each barrage a reminder of the tenuousness of survival. Yet beneath this chaos, within the trench system itself, soldiers contended with a host of hidden adversaries. Mud, water, and filth turned living quarters into hazardous environments, fostering disease, infection, and despair. Rats, drawn by both waste and decay, proliferated with audacious boldness, gnawing at food, uniforms, and sometimes flesh. Lice infested clothing and bedding, spreading both discomfort and epidemic typhus. The trenches, while offering protection from bullets and shells, became prisons. confining men to narrow corridors where the air was thick with smoke, dampness, and the unshakable scent of death. The psychological toll of trench life was profound. Initial enthusiasm, often fueled by patriotic fervor and nationalistic propaganda, gave way to the grim reality of mud, blood, and endless waiting. Letters from home, when they arrived, provided fleeting comfort, but also highlighted the separation between the front line and the world left behind. Soldiers were forced to reconcile the romantic ideals of heroism and glory with the relentless monotony, terror, and suffering of daily life. Many adapted with remarkable resilience, developing routines to endure boredom and fear, rotating duties, repairing fortifications, and scavenging for food or materials. Yet cracks soon appeared in even the most disciplined units. Shell shock and early understanding of what would later be called post-traumatic stress merged as a devastating consequence of prolonged exposure to bombardment, fear, and witnessing death on a scale unimaginable in previous wars. The mind became as fragile as the body, and survival demanded mastery over both. Despite these hardships, the trench networks were meticulously engineered. Frontline trenches, often zigzagging to minimize the impact of explosions and enfilade fire, were reinforced with sandbags, timber, and corrugated iron. Communication trenches connected front lines to support positions, enabling movement of men, supplies, and wounded soldiers while minimizing exposure. Dugouts, sometimes several meters deep, provided rudimentary shelter from artillery and weather, while machine gun nests and barbed wire entanglements created formidable obstacles for enemy assaults. Engineers and laborers worked ceaselessly to improve these structures, understanding that the effectiveness of a trench could mean the difference between life and death for entire battalions. Yet even the most fortified trench could not offer absolute protection. The relentless force of modern weaponry ensured that no soldier could feel truly safe, and each day became an exercise in navigating the delicate balance between concealment and engagement. The contrast between initial patriotic enthusiasm and the grim reality of trench life was stark and telling. Many young men, inspired by national rhetoric and the promise of adventure, arrived at the front convinced that they would partake in heroic deeds of battlefield glory. Yet the reality they encountered was far more harrowing. Days stretched into weeks and months, punctuated by sudden, terrifying bursts of violence. Rain transformed trenches into quagmires, frost into a relentless adversary during winter months. Illness, injury, and death were omnipresent companions, and the ideal of heroism was measured less in daring charges and more in endurance, resourcefulness, and the ability to survive under relentless stress. Soldiers adapted to their environment, developing strategies to cope with both physical and psychological hazards, from improvised latrines to rituals that sustained morale. Survival became an act of ingenuity as much as courage, and camaraderie was a lifeline, binding men together in the face of unrelenting adversity. The stalemate that emerged along the Western Front crystallized the transformative nature of trench warfare. Neither side could advance without suffering catastrophic losses, and neither could retreat without conceding critical territory. Battles became measured in yards rather than miles, with offensives producing staggering casualties for minimal gain. Artillery barrages, designed to soften enemy defenses, often failed to destroy barbed wire or deeply entrenched positions, leaving infantry to cross fields of fire under near certain danger. The static nature of the front line also magnified logistical challenges. Supplying troops with food, ammunition, and medical care became a Herculean task, further intensifying the daily struggle for survival. Commanders grappled with the limitations imposed by entrenched defense, while soldiers endured the physical and psychological hardships imposed by life in mud and wire. Yet even within this grim reality, the trenches shaped a new understanding of warfare. Industrialized weaponry had rendered traditional tactics obsolete, and survival, endurance, and adaptation became the true measures of military effectiveness. The soldiers of the Western Front were forced to confront the dual nature of their existence. Each day presented both a deadly battlefield and a fragile sanctuary. Each night a reprieve that offered little comfort from the memories of loss and fear. The trenches were no longer merely a strategy. They were a theater of human endurance, a crucible in which courage, ingenuity, and resilience were tested in the most extreme conditions imaginable. As the war progressed, the lessons of trench warfare reverberated across Europe. Commanders studied fortifications, engineers refined construction techniques, and soldiers adapted to a rhythm dictated by mud, shellfire, and unrelenting danger. Trenches defined the Western Front, shaping not only the conduct of battles but the very experience of war itself. They forced a re-evaluation of military strategy, highlighting the lethal efficiency of modern weaponry and the human capacity for endurance under unimaginable stress. And within these narrow, waterlogged corridors, soldiers lived a reality that contrasted sharply with the ideals of heroism and glory. A world where survival was a daily triumph and death was the Western Front were never merely defensive positions. They were living entities, hostile and unforgiving, shaped by the relentless interaction of man, machine, and earth. For the soldiers confined within their narrow confines, the daily struggle began the moment they awoke to the acrid smell of wet earth, smoke, and decay. Each day was a test of endurance, an exercise in survival, where the enemy was not only the opposing army, but the mud, the rain, and the invisible scourge of disease. Hunger gnawed at stomachs, already weakened by rationing and poor nutrition, while dysentery, typhoid, and trench fever ravaged men's bodies with merciless precision. These afflictions did not discriminate. Officers and privates alike suffered under the same conditions, and no rank offered immunity from the grinding terror of illness compounded by the unyielding demands of war. Food, when it arrived, was meager and monotonous, often cold, damp, and insufficient to sustain men in the energy-sapping environment of the trenches. Hardtack biscuits, thin soups, and salted meat formed the bulk of daily rations, providing neither comfort nor adequate nutrition. Soldiers scavenged relentlessly, exchanging portions of their rations for scraps of vegetables, cheese, or bread, clinging to whatever morsels could bring a semblance of normalcy. Yet even the simplest meal carried risks. Spoiled food, contaminated water, and the ever-present lice could transform sustenance into a vehicle of disease. Starvation was not always dramatic or sudden. It seeped into bones and muscles, slowly eroding strength and willpower. a quiet enemy that compounded the terror of constant bombardment and exposure to the elements. Rats, an omnipresent horror of trench life, thrived in this environment of filth and decay. Enormous, fearless, and ravenous, they scavenged the trenches with audacity, gnawing on food supplies, uniforms, and occasionally the bodies of the fallen. Soldiers attempted to combat these creatures through traps, poison, or sheer swatting, but their numbers were inexhaustible, their presence a constant reminder of the filth surrounding them. Lice, tiny and nearly invisible, infested clothing and bedding, spreading trench fever and ensuring that no moment of respite was free from discomfort. The incessant scratching and irritation became a psychological torment, adding to the weariness produced by continuous shelling, fatigue, and fear. Disease and vermin were as lethal as any gun or artillery shell, eroding both physical capability and morale in a slow, unrelenting campaign of attrition. The threat of sudden death was omnipresent. Artillery barrages could erupt without warning, transforming the earth into a shaking, exploding nightmare. Soldiers learned to recognize the subtle signs, the whistle of an incoming shell, the faint tremor beneath their boots, but even this knowledge offered only a slim advantage. Snipers, hidden in shattered ruins or camouflaged behind mounds of earth, waited for moments of exposure, claiming lives with a single shot. Gas attacks introduced another layer of terror, with chlorine and mustard gas seeping through the air, leaving men to choke, burn, or succumb to agonizing suffocation. Fear became a constant companion, shaping every movement, every decision, every thought. Soldiers adapted to this new reality with grim determination, learning to ration courage as carefully as food and ammunition. Letters from home offered a fragile lifeline to the world beyond mud and barbed wire. Written words carried hope, longing, and reminders of normal life, yet they could also intensify the psychological strain. Messages described birthdays missed, the growth of children left behind, or the quiet life continuing elsewhere, highlighting the stark contrast with the unceasing horror of the front. Some letters brought brief comfort, moments of solace during a night of restless sleep or in the hollowed-out shelter of a dugout. Others reminded soldiers of everything they had lost, amplifying the isolation and despair inherent in trench life. Even correspondence had to be rationed and cautiously shared, as letters were censored, delayed, or lost entirely, leaving soldiers in a liminal state of hope and anxiety. Camaraderie became the essential bulwark against this relentless psychological and physical torment. Bonds forged in the mud were more than friendships. They were mechanisms of survival. Soldiers shared stories to distract from the constant fear, scavenged supplies together, and comforted one another when grief or trauma threatened to overwhelm. Humor, dark and ironic, became a coping mechanism. Sarcastic remarks, jokes about lice or the absurdity of bureaucracy, and playful rituals helped maintain morale. Yet these connections were fragile, threatened constantly by death, disease, and the relentless pace of bombardment. A comrade lost could shatter morale instantly, leaving survivors to navigate their fear in isolation, grappling with grief while continuing the same exhausting routines. In this environment, camaraderie was not just a social phenomenon. It was an essential strategy for enduring both the horrors above ground and the psychological weight of entrapment below it. The physical environment itself imposed an unrelenting series of challenges. Trenches filled with water during rainstorms, leaving soldiers to wade in mud and filth for hours. Feet would swell, blister, and rot in conditions that were impossible to fully mitigate, leading to the infamous trench foot, a condition that could render a soldier immobile and often required amputation. Cold, damp, and exhaustion combined to sap energy and resolve, creating conditions where simple tasks became monumental efforts. Every movement required concentration. Every action was a negotiation with the dangers that lurked both above and below the trench walls. The earth, once a protector, could easily become a trap, collapsing under bombardment or simply eroding in heavy rains, forcing men to rebuild continuously, night after night, in the shadow of death. Even moments of relative calm were deceptive, filled with tension and vigilance. Soldiers slept lightly, always prepared to leap into action at the sound of an alarm or the tremor of an approaching shell. Conversations were hushed, laughter carefully moderated to avoid drawing attention. The mind became attuned to the environment, reading subtle cues in the wind, the smell of smoke, or the distant sound of movement. Every instinct, sharpened by experience and necessity, became a tool for survival. But this heightened awareness was exhausting, creating a mental fatigue that could rival the physical exhaustion produced by continuous labor and exposure. The mind and body became intertwined in a relentless struggle against both visible and invisible threats. Routines provided a fragile structure to these otherwise chaotic lives. Soldiers took turns in guard duty, trench maintenance, and foraging. They cleaned weapons, patched up fortifications, and performed any number of repetitive tasks designed to keep them occupied and engaged. These routines were often the difference between mental stability and breakdown. The smallest AXA shared cigarette, a makeshift meal, a letter read aloud became anchors to a world that seemed otherwise unmoored. In this sense, survival in the trenches was not solely physical. It required immense psychological discipline, creativity, and endurance. The ever-present shadow of death shaped every thought and action. Men calculated movements meticulously, knowing that a misstep could be fatal. Attacks were timed, coordinated, and meticulously planned, yet success was never guaranteed. Survivors became acutely aware of the fragility of life. Each day a mixture of routine, terror, and fleeting moments of reflection, humor, camaraderie, and ingenuity became tools as essential as rifles, bayonets, or sandbags. Soldiers became masters of improvisation, fashioning rudimentary defenses, repairing clothing, and discovering small comforts wherever possible. The struggle against mud, vermin, disease, and fear was as strategic as any military maneuver, a testament to the adaptability of the human spirit, the juxtaposition of everyday life with the extraordinary danger of combat created a surreal existence. Men ate, slept, and cleaned in the shadow of potential annihilation, navigating the psychological tension between normalcy and terror. The earth beneath them, saturated with water, blood, and debris, was both shield and hazard. No ritual, no task could completely mitigate the dangers present at every moment. Yet soldiers persisted, adapting to the environment with grim determination. Life in the trenches became a complex dance with death. a continuous negotiation between survival, duty, and human resilience, despite the filth, disease, and omnipresent threat of violence. Soldiers forged identities and routines that allowed them to endure. They discovered strategies to cope with the monotony and terror, developed bonds that could withstand the harshest conditions, and found small moments of solace amidst the chaos. Letters from home, shared humor, and fleeting acts of kindness became lifelines in a world defined by mud, rats, lice, and unending shellfire. In these trenches, the ordinary soldier confronted the extremities of human experience, fear, suffering, endurance, and courage, each day a testament to the capacity of humanity to survive against seemingly insurmountable honed by millennia to endure scarcity, can persist under astonishingly harsh conditions, but only when the mind and ingenuity rise to meet necessity. Across Europe, Asia, and the far reaches of rural civilizations, famine and scarcity had always stalked the vulnerable. Yet the Great War and its broader conflicts amplified this struggle to a new, almost unbearable intensity. Soldiers, civilians, and peasants alike confronted the merciless calculus of hunger, forced to reconcile with the fact that familiar meals, bread, vegetables, meat were luxuries beyond reach. In the trenches or on the ravaged countryside, survival demanded an almost primal adaptation, finding sustenance wherever it could be coaxed from the land, however unappealing or seemingly inedible it might appear. This was the era in which humans ate grass and weeds, bark and roots, moss and leaves, testing the limits of both physiology and endurance. Historical chronicles from famines and sieges offer haunting testimonies to this struggle. In rural villages, during wartime blockades or droughts, families documented the desperate measures they took to stave off death. Children were sent to fields at dawn to collect the tender shoots of wild grasses, while adults dug for roots buried beneath layers of frost or soil, often consuming them raw or boiling them into foul-tasting broths. Leaves that would normally feed livestock became a meal, steeped repeatedly to extract the faintest traces of nutrition. Bark from trees, stripped carefully to avoid killing the tree entirely, was ground into coarse flour or boiled to produce bitter soups. Moss, lichens, and even watercress from contaminated streams were incorporated into diets with an ingenuity born of necessity. Each of these actions was not simply about eating. It was a ritual of survival, a deliberate confrontation with the body's urgent demands in a world stripped bare of conventional resources. Accounts of peasants and soldiers alike underscore the grotesque juxtaposition of human suffering and resilience. One chronicler from Eastern Europe recounted the winter of 1916 when entire villages subsisted almost exclusively on grass and tree bark, boiling leaves in water until their once vibrant color was reduced to a grayish mush palatable only because it prolonged life. Men and women would chew raw shoots in the fields, the chlorophyll bitter against their tongues, their teeth grinding fibrous material that left them raw-mouthed and sore. Yet, in these accounts, a recurring theme emerges, a grim ingenuity, a refusal to surrender to the inevitability of starvation. Each new method of extracting nutrition was a small victory, a triumph of mind over circumstance, a demonstration of human tenacity in the face of physical extremity. The science behind These desperate measures reveals why certain plants, though unpalatable, could sustain life. Grass, while indigestible in large quantities for humans, provides limited calories and essential fiber when combined with boiling or fermentation. Roots and tubers, even if bitter or fibrous, offer carbohydrates and minerals critical for energy and metabolic function. Leaves contain trace vitamins and nutrients, and moss or lichens, though requiring careful preparation, can supplement diets when no alternatives exist. These natural resources, often dismissed as inedible in ordinary times, became vital. Survival hinged not only on availability, but on knowledge, knowing which plants were toxic, how to prepare them safely, and how to combine them to extract the maximum nourishment. In this way, necessity became a teacher, forcing entire populations to master botanical knowledge under extreme pressure. The psychological aspect of consuming grass and weeds must not be overlooked. In societies where communal meals were central to social cohesion, turning to wild plants represented a profound disruption of normal life. The act of eating grass, once the domain of livestock, became both a humbling and horrifying experience. Soldiers in wartime diaries described the shame, embarrassment, and desperation of scraping moss from walls or chewing boiled leaves to stave off hunger. Yet, alongside this trauma was a form of psychological empowerment, the ability to find sustenance where none seemed possible, to confront starvation head-on with creativity, courage, and unyielding determination. In these acts, survival was not merely physical. It was an assertion of human agency in the face of overwhelming deprivation. Gruesome imagery often dominates these historical records. Chroniclers speak of peasants gnawing on the roots of trees exposed by frost, their hands raw and bleeding, their lips cracked from cold and exertion. Soldiers report stripping bark from the edges of forests, carefully avoiding the inner layers that could kill the tree, boiling it to create a bitter sludge that filled the belly without satisfying the appetite. Children were sometimes forced to forage for tender shoots, while adults labored to convert moss into a consumable substance, their bodies weakened but refusing to collapse entirely. Yet, within these descriptions of suffering lies the remarkable capacity for human adaptation. Where one might expect despair to dominate, these acts reveal calculation, knowledge, and resourcefulness, the raw instincts of survival, elevated by scomped intellect and courage. The contrast between the grotesque and the resilient is striking. To an outsider, chewing grass or consuming bark may appear desperate or even horrifying. But for those living in these conditions, it was an extraordinary act of ingenuity, a testament to human adaptability and tenacity. Each meal, no matter how meager or unpleasant, represented an understanding of the environment, a mastery of natural resources, and an unwavering commitment to life itself. It was in these moments, amid the bitter and the foul, that the human spirit asserted itself, refusing to yield to the extremity of circumstance. Historical narratives highlight not only individual survival, but also communal ingenuity. Families shared knowledge of edible plants, exchanged recipes for bitter broths, and worked collectively to forage fields and forests. Soldiers, trapped behind enemy lines or in besieged cities, adapted these same strategies, often collaborating to identify safe plants and maximize nutrition. Such cooperation was crucial, for starvation was a communal problem, threatening not just individuals but entire units or villages. The ingenuity displayed in these circumstances reveals a profound human instinct. Survival is both an individual challenge and a collective endeavor, relying on shared knowledge, coordinated effort, and unshakable determination. The broader significance of these survival tactics extends beyond their immediate impact. Eating grass, bark, and weeds became emblematic of a broader human confrontation with scarcity and mortality. It highlighted the thin line between civilization and subsistence, between comfort and desperation, and between social norms and the demands of survival. These acts were more than responses to hunger. They were an assertion of life in the face of systemic collapse, an endurance that would resonate in collective memory long after the immediate crisis passed. Scholars and chroniclers have since noted that such ingenuity under extreme conditions is a hallmark of human adaptability, reflecting both biological necessity and psychological resilience. Yet, even within the practice of survival, there were consequences. Nutritional deficiencies, digestive problems, and long-term health impacts were common. Bitter and fibrous diets could lead to chronic illness, and the physical toll of foraging in harsh weather added to already severe exhaustion. Nonetheless, these extreme measures allowed countless individuals to survive when conventional food sources failed, bridging the gap between despair and the possibility of life. In every mouthful of grass, every boiled leaf, and every morsel of moss, there was a negotiation with mortality, a conscious, deliberate confrontation with the limits of endurance. The human ingenuity exhibited in these survival tactics speaks to a timeless truth: starvation and adversity do not merely strip away life, they also reveal the capacity for adaptation, creativity, and resilience. From peasants scavenging frost-bitten fields to soldiers navigating desolate battlefields, the act of turning weeds, bark, and grass into sustenance reflects an extraordinary confrontation with the most primal challenges of existence. It is a reminder that the human spirit, when pressed to its extremes, can transform desperation into resourcefulness, horror into survival, and suffering into a testament of endurance. Across historical records, diaries, and personal accounts, this chapter of survival emerges not as a footnote but as a central narrative of human resilience. Eating grass and weeds, consuming bark and moss, was both grotesque and heroic, a vivid illustration of how necessity can drive ingenuity. The grotesque imagery, the bitter tastes, and the physical tolls are inseparable from the story of survival. Yet within them lies the extraordinary affirmation of life. Humanity's confrontation with starvation during times of war and famine is a story of adaptation, courage, and relentless perseverance's story, where every scrap of green, every root unearthed, and every bitter bite becomes a small triumph. Against the overwhelming forces of deprivation, survival in these conditions required more than physical strength. It demanded knowledge, creativity, cooperation, and an unyielding commitment to life. It demanded that individuals confront the horror of their circumstances with ingenuity, and that they transform scarcity expanse of the trenches. Heroism was rarely defined by grand gestures or the sweeping maneuvers glorified in textbooks. It was measured in endurance, ingenuity, and the quiet courage to persist amidst unimaginable horror. Soldiers developed survival techniques that transformed the trenches from mere defensive positions into complex, adaptive networks, demonstrating a resourcefulness that was as remarkable as it was essential. Dugouts and makeshift shelters, often carved painstakingly into the earth, offered refuge from bombardments, rain, and the bitter cold. Soldiers reinforced these spaces with timber, sandbags, and whatever scraps of material they could salvage, fashioning fragile sanctuaries in a landscape defined by destruction. Some dugouts extended for several meters, forming rudimentary underground networks where entire platoons could live, eat, and recover without leaving the relative safety of the trench system. In these subterranean worlds, ingenuity became a lifeline, a quiet testament to the human spirit's capacity to adapt under pressure. Scavenging became a central aspect of daily survival. Soldiers learned to extract utility from the debris of battle, transforming discarded shells, wood, and even corpses into tools, furniture, or defensive reinforcements. Clothing, torn and tattered, was patched meticulously. Boots were relaced, socks dried, and makeshift stoves improvised from empty tins. Every small act of resourcefulness was an assertion of control in a world where control was otherwise stripped away by the chaos of war. Yet, alongside these practical innovations, soldiers found ways to assert their humanity, often through small acts of defiance. They carved initials into trench walls, painted crude images, and wrote messages on pieces of wood or fabric, leaving traces of individuality in a landscape otherwise dominated by mud, wire, and death. In these gestures, humor, creativity, and defiance intertwined, signaling that even in the darkest circumstances, the human need to express identity could not be extinguished. Letters, diaries, and memoirs offer a window into the intimate struggles of these men, capturing the nuances of life in the trenches that statistics and battle reports cannot convey. A soldier might write of the relief found in a shared meal, the quiet camaraderie of washing clothes together, or the transient joy of a letter from home. Others recount the terror of artillery barrages, the anguish of losing comrades, or the shivering hours spent in waterlogged trenches. These documents are both historical records and deeply personal narratives, blending fear, hope, despair, and resilience. In reading them, one gains a sense of the extraordinary psychological endurance demanded by trench warfare, the ability to navigate both physical danger and the relentless strain of mental fatigue, to hold on to fragments of hope while immersed in unceasing horror. Amidst the despair, fleeting moments of hope illuminated the trenches like sudden, ephemeral beacons. A shared cigarette, the delivery of hot coffee, or the first rays of sun breaking through storm clouds could transform the bleakest day into a small triumph. Soldiers celebrated birthdays with whispered ceremonies, played makeshift games, and sang songs to preserve morale. Even brief interactions with civilians or local children, when possible, offered reminders of life beyond mud and barbed wire. These transient episodes were not mere distractions. They were essential for maintaining the spirit necessary to endure. Humanity persisted in these acts, asserting itself against the overwhelming machinery of destruction. Heroism in this context was not always about charging into enemy fire. It was about surviving adapting, and finding glimmers of dignity and purpose in a landscape otherwise dominated by suffering. The human spirit revealed itself most vividly in moments of solidarity. Comrades shared resources, comforted the dying, and supported one another in ways that statistics cannot capture. Soldiers risked their lives to rescue wounded friends, sometimes crawling into no man's land under fire, driven not by orders but by loyalty and compassion. Such acts demonstrate that even in a world defined by mechanized death, interpersonal bonds remained crucial. Courage became intertwined with empathy, and survival was inseparable from the ability to sustain and protect others. These stories, recorded in diaries and later memoirs, became enduring testaments to the resilience, ingenuity, and moral complexity of men confronting the extremities of war. Through these narratives, a pattern emerges. Heroism in the trenches was as much about adaptability and perseverance as it was about gallantry in battle. Soldiers transformed adversity into opportunity, using the environment, materials, every act of ingenuity, every shared laugh, every stolen moment of reprieve reinforced the underlying truth that the human spirit can persist even amidst extreme deprivation, fear, and death. The trenches, though instruments of suffering, became stages upon which these small yet profound acts of heroism played out, leaving a legacy of endurance and humanity that endures in memory. Once the defining feature of industrialized warfare did not remain eternal. As the Great War progressed, military strategists, engineers, and commanders sought ways to break the stalemate that had come to define the Western Front. The deadlock was brutal and costly. Thousands of men perished for mere meters of land, and the static nature of the lines magnified the attrition and suffering already inflicted by the war's early years. Innovations in weaponry, logistics, and tactics gradually undermined the primacy of trench systems, heralding the decline of entrenched warfare and the rise of new operational strategies. The evolution was driven both by necessity and by technological advancements that promised mobility, firepower, and the ability to bypass the otherwise impenetrable defenses of the trenches. Tanks, introduced late in the war, represented a revolutionary response to the stalemate. Early models were slow, cumbersome, and mechanically unreliable, but they embodied a conceptual breakthrough: machines capable of traversing barbed wire, crushing obstacles, and providing moving cover for advancing infantry. The psychological impact of these armored vehicles was significant, instilling fear in defenders who had grown accustomed to static warfare. Coupled with improved artillery tactics, creeping barrages, and coordinated infantry assaults, tanks began to challenge the defensive advantage that trenches had long provided. While the technology was in its infancy, its potential to restore mobility and initiative marked a turning point, signaling that warfare would increasingly emphasize movement, coordination, and mechanized power over static fortifications. In addition to tanks, developments in combined arms strategy reshaped battlefield dynamics. Artillery became more precise, and coordination with infantry improved, allowing attacks to penetrate entrenched positions with devastating effect. Air reconnaissance, increasingly sophisticated, enabled commanders to identify weak points in enemy lines and plan operations with unprecedented accuracy. These innovations collectively eroded the advantages that trenches had historically conferred, shifting the balance toward offense and forcing defenders to adapt or risk catastrophic losses. The result was a slow but inevitable decline in the dominance of static trench systems, replaced by strategies that sought to integrate mobility, firepower, and intelligence into a cohesive operational framework. The decline of the stalemate had profound implications for military doctrine. Commanders learned that defense alone was insufficient in the face of coordinated, technologically enhanced offensives. The lessons of the trenches informed post-war military thinking, emphasizing the need for flexibility, adaptability, and integration of emerging technologies. The harrowing experience of static warfare also reinforced the psychological dimensions of strategy, maintaining morale, logistical support, and human resilience were as critical as tactical positioning or firepower. The ghosts of the trench's memory, trauma, and the enduring image of mud, wire, and shattered earthwood shape how armies approached both training and engagement for generations. Yet the decline of trench warfare did not erase its legacy. The landscapes of World War I remained scarred long after the guns fell silent, a physical testament to the war's destructiveness. Former trenches became historical markers, reminders of both human suffering and ingenuity. Veterans carried the psychological imprint of prolonged exposure to confined, dangerous conditions, influencing post-war culture, literature, and art. The trench became a symbol, representing both the horrors of industrialized conflict and the extraordinary resilience of those who endured it. Lessons learned from the trenches were integrated into doctrines of defense, urban warfare, and even future mechanized operations, reflecting a nuanced understanding of how geography, technology, and human endurance interact in combat. As warfare evolved, so too did the conception of the soldier's role. Mobility and mechanization emphasized coordination, speed, and tactical adaptability, reducing the reliance on static fortifications. Infantry units were trained to exploit breaches, maneuver in coordination with tanks and artillery, and respond dynamically to fluid battlefield conditions. Supply chains were improved to sustain mobile operations, and communication systems evolved to enable rapid decision-making. The transition from static trench warfare to mobile combined arms operations marked not merely a technical shift, but a profound transformation in the philosophy of combat, redefining how military power could be projected, sustained, and preserved. Despite the technological and strategic advancements, the memory of the trenches remained vivid. Soldiers who had endured years of static warfare carried both scars and lessons forward, influencing doctrine and training long after the cessation of hostilities. The trenches had taught commanders the lethal efficiency of industrialized weaponry, the importance of human endurance, and the consequences of prolonged attrition. These lessons resonated in subsequent conflicts, shaping the design of fortifications, defensive planning, and operational strategy. The ghosts of mud, wire, and blood became enduring teachers, reminding future generations that warfare is as much about human resilience as it is about machinery or firepower. Ultimately, the decline of trench warfare reflects the dynamic interplay between technology, strategy, and human endurance. Fortifications, once central to battlefield success, were gradually supplanted by mobile, mechanized operations capable of circumventing static defenses. The stalemate that had defined years of horrific attrition gave way to fluidity, innovation, and integrated operational planning. Yet the psychological, cultural, and historical imprint of the trenches endured, shaping narratives of courage, suffering, and human ingenuity. These networks of mud, timber, and wire, once instruments of death and suffering, became enduring symbols of both the horrors of war and the extraordinary capacity for human adaptation under extreme pressure. Even as the battlefields evolved, the lessons of the trenches persisted. They underscored the necessity of balancing technological innovation with human factors, demonstrated the consequences of prolonged attrition, and highlighted the importance of morale, ingenuity, and adaptability. The decline of the stalemate did not erase the suffering endured within these earthen corridors, nor did it diminish the acts of courage, defiance, and resilience that had characterized trench life. Instead, the evolution of warfare built upon these experiences, integrating hard-won lessons into doctrines that would define the conduct of armies for decades to come. The trenches, though increasingly obsolete, remained a haunting and instructive legacy, shaping how humanity understood the relationship between strategy, technology, and the endurance of the human spirit, left an imprint that extended far beyond the mud, barbed wire, and shattered earth of the battlefield. Though they were built for defense and survival, their influence seeped into every facet of post-war society, shaping literature, art, and collective memory. Soldiers emerged from the war transformed, their experiences seared into memory, carrying burdens both visible and invisible. The horrors endured shell shock, prolonged exposure to violence, disease, and deprivation produced psychological scars that would be recognized decades later under the name PTSD. Though at the time there was no vocabulary to fully describe the trauma, men returned to cities and villages, but the trenches traveled with them. A mental landscape as harrowing and complex as any physical battlefield they had traversed. Post-war literature became one of the first avenues through which the world glimpsed the hidden realities of trench life. Authors and poetsmen who had survived artillery barrages, frost-bitten winters, and ceaseless bombardments translated the relentless monotony, fear, and horror of the trenches into words that stunned the public imagination. Works like Eric Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front and Siegfried Sassoon's poems conveyed a stark truth. The human cost of war was far greater than any glory claimed by propagandists or generals. These narratives did more than memorialize suffering. They interrogated the real acts of courage, they suggested, were not always tied to battlefield exploits or victories, but to enduring, unending adversity, maintaining compassion amidst horror, and simply surviving the unthinkable. Trench experiences, with their mixture of physical exhaustion, fear, and fleeting moments of camaraderie, provided a lens through which the world began to understand mirrored this literary reckoning. Painters and illustrators depicted the trenches not as arenas of heroism, but as landscapes of devastation, conveying the omnipresent mud, the twisted remnants of barbed wire, and the skeletal forms of shattered trees. The visual language of war shifted from glorified charge lines and gallant cavalry to the intimate horrors of daily survival. The crouching soldier, shivering in a waterlogged trench, the scavenging of sparse rations, the communal effort to patch walls or digouts after relentless shelling. Through these depictions, artists invited viewers to confront the full sensory reality of trench life, the smell, the sound, the ceaseless tension, creating a new form of historical testimony that transcended statistics and battle reports. The trenches, in art as in literature, became a symbol of the human struggle to persist under conditions designed to break both body and spirit. Yet, the psychological legacy of trench warfare extended far deeper than expression alone. Soldiers returned from the front lines profoundly altered, their minds shaped by constant exposure to extreme fear and mortality. At the time, these psychological wounds were poorly understood. Diagnoses like shell shock were rudimentary, often misattributed to weakness or lack of discipline, yet they captured the pervasive mental toll of extended combat. Men struggled to reintegrate into civilian life, haunted by nightmares, sudden panic, or the inability to tolerate noise and crowds. Families bore witness to the invisible scars, often unable to comprehend the depth of trauma. The trenches had taught soldiers lessons in endurance and resilience, but at a cost that would echo for years, influencing not only personal lives, but social and medical understanding of war's mental consequences. The contrast between the invisible suffering of soldiers and the glorified image of war propagated by governments and media created a persistent tension in post-war culture. Public ceremonies, monuments, and official histories often emphasized valor, conquest, and national pride, effectively obscuring the mundane yet harrowing realities of trench life. Narratives leaving many veterans feeling alienated, their experiences dismissed or misunderstood. Yet in private accounts, diaries, and memoirs, the truth persisted. The heroism of the trenches was less about conquest and more about enduring the daily impossibilities imposed by war. It was found in acts of ingenuity, in scavenging for food or water, in comforting a comrade, or surviving a relentless bombardment without succumbing to despair. These quiet victories, hidden in mud and fear, formed a legacy of resilience that would inform the cultural understanding of war for generations. The influence of trench experiences. Following World War I, the stark lessons of immobility, attrition, and technological lethality were meticulously studied by military theorists and planners. Commanders recognized the limitations of static defenses, while innovations in mobility, armored vehicles, and coordinated artillery reflected the effort to avoid the psychological and symbolic memory of the trenches remained potent. Training programs, fortification designs, and combat simulations all incorporated lessons from the trenches, ensuring that the realities of life under constant threat continued to shape military thinking. The ghosts of mud, wire, and relentless bombardment persisted as both warning and guide, a reminder of the human cost inherent in prolonged, mechanized warfare. Despite the passage of time, the trenches continue to resonate in cultural memory. Monuments, museums, and preserved battlefields provide tangible connections to the suffering and endurance of those who lived within these earthen corridors. Visitors encounter not only physical remnants, graters, dugouts, barbed wire, but also narratives that capture the human dimension, diaries, photographs, and personal artifacts that tell of exhaustion, fear, ingenuity, and fleeting moments of solace. The trenches, though long abandoned, continue to serve as powerful reminders of both the horrors of war and the extraordinary capacity for human endurance. Through these preserved spaces, contemporary audiences can confront the lived realities of soldiers whose survival demanded courage and ingenuity equal to any feat of arms. The hidden legacy of trench life is ultimately one of perspective. History often glorifies battles, leaders, and territorial conquest. But the trenches teach a different lesson. Heroism is as often found in survival, resourcefulness, and compassion as it is in grand victories. Soldiers endured unimaginable suffering, yet they also demonstrated remarkable ingenuity in forcing shelters, scavenging supplies, sharing scarce resources, and maintaining morale through humor, ritual, and solidarity, forged a form of heroism invisible to those who never lived it but no less profound. These acts of endurance, recorded in diaries, letters, memoirs, and art, offer enduring testimony to the human spirit, a quiet triumph that survived long after the guns fell silent. The trench experience, with all its horror and resilience, shapes how history remembers the First World War. It challenges the conventional understanding of heroism, compelling modern audiences to recognize courage not merely as aggressive conquest, but as the relentless persistence of humanity under extreme duress. It underscores the psychological and social dimensions of conflict, revealing that the true legacy of war is not only measured in victories or territorial gains, but in the endurance, ingenuity, and compassion exhibited by those caught in its relentless machinery. The trenches, both physical and psychological, remain an enduring symbol of survival, a testament to human adaptation in the face of overwhelming adversity, conditions designed to extinguish life itself. Conclusion: the trenches were more than dirt and wood. They were crucibles of endurance, fear, and fleeting hope. Soldiers trapped within them endured horrors that textbooks barely hint at, yet their struggles shaped the very fabric of modern warfare. From mud to memory, from despair to heroism, the trenches remain a silent testament to the cost of human conflict, in the resilience of the human spirit. They remind us that history is not solely forged in victories or campaigns, but in the daily, relentless acts of survival. Extraordinary circumstances. The legacy of the trenches endures not only in preserved battlefields or historical texts, but in the collective understanding of human endurance, the consequences of mechanized war, and the extraordinary capacity of people to persist against unimaginable odds. In remembering the trenches, we honor not just the wars fought, but the quiet, steadfast heroism that allowed life, hope, and humanity to endure amidst chaos.